So I'm going to give it a few more minutes here and get people logged in here. I know Kendall can't make it, and DJ Smith was going to be a little late.
Senator Hertz, this is Nancy Hall, and I'm going to be trying to run the meeting today. We're
All
having a
right.
little technical difficulties. And so I think we're on. I think we're good to go ahead and start. If you'd like me to call roll, I can do that.
Just a sec here. So I saw DJ's. Okay, DJ, let's get DJ promoted. He's promoted now to panelist. We can probably, let's see who else we got. I think Justin Ross. I know Justin wasn't going to make it, and I hadn't heard from Commissioner Galt. So instead of taking roll, I will note that all the subcommittee attendees are here with the exception of Commissioner Galt, Mr. Ross, and Mr. Cotton. So Cindy, or Nancy, if you're ready to go, let's go. We can start recording.
It is recording. You're
All
good.
right, perfect. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Today on the agenda, we're gonna take another look at kind of mostly Senate Bill 511 and walk through that a little bit. I know there was the worksheet was sent out to everybody, so we can take a look at that and have some discussion about that and where and if we want to go forward with something like that. And then we also have someone from the state of Utah to talk about their truth and taxation law a little bit for us, and then we will kind of formalize and talk about some of possible recommendations going forward and discuss our next meeting. So with that, I guess we can get into the work session on Senate Bill 511. Who is going to lead that?
I'll
So,
lead it. Dylan Cole from Department
okay.
of Revenue. Eric's not in the office today, so I'm tasked with filling his shoes. I can either share my screen, I guess, if we wanted to mess with the worksheet live, or I don't know, Senator Hertz, your call.
Yeah, maybe if you want to share your worksheet and we'll just kind of remind people as to what Senate Bill 511 has done. And then if we want to make a little bit of a change here and there, but maybe if you could just give us a fresh, brief overview, Dylan,
Sure.
of what this kind of accomplishes.
So again, Eric made this tool that essentially goes backwards in time to 2016, although he has added the functionality to change that. And basically looks at how sensitive the growth in property taxes are to changing 1510-420. I think from our standpoint, this kind of grew out of a curiosity about how newly taxable was influencing 1510-420, and then we just kind of built the rest of the pieces after we had sort of gone down that route. So 1510-420, what it does is it allows taxing jurisdictions to grow by half the rate of inflation. So that's this 50% amount here. And then they get 100% of newly taxable growth. And anytime a TIF expires, they get that as well. And then as part of Senate Bill 511 last session, which is sort of grew out of this tool and talking with legislators, there's the idea of if we give greater inflation adjustments than just 50%, do we want to have a hard cap on the amount of inflation that can happen? We do that with school budgets. We cap it at 3%. And then also, would we like to have an overall cap on how fast property taxes can grow? Right now, there is not an overall cap. And then there's also potentially the possibility in this model for a population adjustment. The way that that works conceptually is a lot of times when we talk about expenditures, we talk about population plus inflation as the benchmark for demand for services. So population adjustment would say if your county is growing, then you get a little more revenue authority than if it weren't growing. And that's basically it. And so when we monkey with these levers, we can sort of see the difference in outcome. So if we wanted to simulate Senate Bill 511 from last session, what that did was it took 50% of newly taxable and gave 100% inflation. There was an inflation cap at 4%, and there was an overall cap at 4.75%, no population adjustments. And that will populate this table with a lot of negative numbers, but it's maybe easier to see if you look at a map. And this shows the effect on a median household by county. So you can see pretty disparate effects across the state, and whether or not that's good or not is sort of up to the purview of the committee. And I think what we're hoping to iron out today is some benchmarks of what are reasonable options besides 15, 10, 420. And maybe the answer is 15, 10, 420 is fine enough. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or suggestions about monkeying with the levers.
So Dylan, in that chart, particularly on the map, that's based on historical. So did it go back and look at giving 100% of inflation capped at 4%?
Yeah, so the map is updated with everything that I changed on this spreadsheet.
Okay.
And I believe what it's doing is it's taking the difference in the final year times the median home value. So these tax savings aren't compounded over years. It's just saying in the final year, what is the difference in taxes paid on the average home or the median home in the county?
Okay. And just a reminder to everybody, one thing that some of the slower growth or non-growth counties liked about this model was they got the full rate of inflation capped at 4% versus half the rate of inflation. And so they kind of like that. Probably the counties that were growing fast with new growth didn't like the bill as much because it forced them to use some of their new growth for offsetting existing taxpayers' taxes. So that's kind of what I recall from the legislative session when we debated this bill. Representative Fern, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the input. Last meeting, I had interest in seeing what would happen if there was a population increase, allowable population increase that was put into the formula. And I don't know what it would be, but I'm wondering, maybe as a compromise to the larger districts, larger counties, that some kind of population differential is included. How might you do that to show us what the impacts are?
Sure. So the way that the population is implemented in this, which I think makes sense logically, is that you just take the year-over-year population change and multiply it by the inflation. So let's say that inflation was 5% and then population growth was 5%. You would take 1.05 times the inflation amount, and so your inflation amount would be 5% higher than it would otherwise in this example. And it's fairly substantial. If you look at the, so let me just tick it off here to take us to where 511 is. You can see that, I mean, your eye should be keyed in on the western side of the state here mostly. So under Senate Bill 511, there's, a range of about $20 in, I guess this is Park County, 30 in Gallatin, $6 in Missoula, that these houses would be paying less. If we allow for population adjustment, you can see that that bumps up somewhere like Missoula, Lake, Flathead, Ravalli, Lewis and Clark. Basically the counties that have positive population increases would be able to levy more money under this population adjustment.
And I'm assuming you can play with the population adjustment. So if policy-wise, folks can thought that was just a little bit too much, it could be fractionalized or something, even more.
Sure. Yeah, Representative Fern. I mean, I don't, just like the legislature in 2001 decided that 1510-420 should be half of inflation. There's no reason to say that we couldn't take half of population change kind of thing. I think that's definitely within the legislature's purview.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Representative Fern. Senator McGilvery.
Thank you. My first question is, I missed the sheet being sent out. I'm sure it's totally my fault, but where's the sheet now?
So I believe what he sent out was the, correct me if I'm wrong, Dylan, but I think they sent out the Excel spreadsheet to people so they could
How
play
about
around.
this tool?
Sorry, I'm less familiar with what steps Eric took to share this out. I'm sure we can get it to you, Senator McGilvery.
Okay, that'd be great. Then I have another question. Can you go back to the map, please? Okay, so if I'm reading the map and I'm looking at Yellowstone, can you go back and take inflation off, or not the inflation, but the population growth? There you go, thanks. All right, so if I'm looking at this correctly, this is Senate Bill 511 from the last session, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then if I look at Yellowstone County, then I'm saying what this says is that in the last year, whatever year that was, say 22, my property tax on the average home would have been $23 less if we had implemented SB 511, if it had been historically implemented.
Correct. Yeah. If it had been implemented back in 2016, the difference in your 2023 tax bill would have been $23 if you owned a median valued home in Yellowstone County.
Can you go back and just for the sake of argument and just pop in 100% for that, allowing new property growth, putting 100% back in the formula? Yeah.
I would guess that this probably won't do much to change things because I would bet that the overall cap is working pretty hard. Oh, no, actually it did change things quite a bit.
So essentially it instead of 19, what was it before? $21?
Yeah, it was in the 20s, I think.
$23 reduction.
All
And
right.
now it's a $3 increase, actually.
Why wouldn't it go the other way? Am I misunderstanding something there?
So the because the entity before Yellowstone County was they could only capture 50% of the growth in new property. So the way that the formula works is you get to pretend like your new growth doesn't exist when you set your mills, and then those mills get applied onto that new growth. What Senate Bill 511 was doing was saying you only get to take away half of your new growth when you're setting your mills. And what that implicitly does is it forces the taxing jurisdiction to have a lower mill value because they have a higher taxable base when they're setting their mill.
So let me say it this way. Is this one right now showing that all of the new taxable growth is included in the inflation formula? Or is it just the opposite?
It's just the opposite. This is the amount they're allowed to deduct from the inflation.
Okay, that's the way it is now, right?
Correct.
Can you put it 0? I see
Zero.
it wrong.
So here's what it is now. It's Yellowstone would be $60 savings for the median home.
All right. Thank you.
So
Not
Dylan,
a,
could you
not,
go
not a
back
substantive
to,
difference.
go ahead. Could you go back to, so I think Senator Gilbert, what's important here, and as we debated this in the Senate, was in any particular year, this isn't going to have a large significant impact. But if you look at this chart over a, 7, 8, 10-year period, it flattens that line out of growth. And so basically that's what it was intended to do, to flatten the growth out, and not right now the budget with 15, 10, 420 and 100% of new growth, it kind of compounds the growth of revenue. And this would, the intent of this is to slow that growth down and flatten it out over a period of time.
So the estimated was with 1510 or with 511.
What was that?
The yellow line or orange line or whatever color it is would be with 511.
So this chart's a little difficult to read. Basically, because our information is not perfect because of voted mills and everything, Eric estimated the amount of county property taxes that are subject to 1510-420. That's what this orange line is. And so what you should be, the salient points of this graph is comparing the orange line to the dotted line. The orange line is our estimate of how 1510-420 has affected property taxes. And then the dashed line is what this tool estimates would happen instead. The gap between the orange and the blue is what's happened due to voted levies, at least as far as we can tell.
As the dotted line with an implementation of 511 historic.
The dotted line is whatever we plug into this formula.
Okay, all right. Gotcha.
Okay. Commissioner Holmquist.
Yeah, did I just hear that the orange line takes into account the voted levies also? Did I hear that?
No, sorry. The orange line is so the blue line is the actual tax dollars levied by county governments. We know what that is. The orange line is our estimate of what percentage of that authority is subject to 1510-420. And then the dashed line is what that estimated authority would look like under a different framework than 1510-420, which we're simulating through this tool.
I think a population factor is important, because I think there's kind of perception out there that just because the county has a large population growth, that they, somehow get more money in their budget. I think that's a perception that's not true. We've been going along with 1510-420 right along, and this year our cash balance is down as low as I've seen it in 14 years. And we're struggling just like the little counties because our expenses are more expensive than a little county. So it all evens out. We all have budget restraints. The only thing that doesn't restrain from new taxes or increased taxes are the voted levies that people vote on. So we have restraints too, and we had a hard time giving a decent COLA this year because, like I say, even with the population growth, everything else is going up, our insurances and all of that. So another question on on 511, you talk about an overall cap. What does that affect any of the voted levies?
No.
Those aren't in there?
Helpless. Yeah, so essentially the way that this overall cap would work conceptually is You go through your 15, 10, 420 calculation and you set your mill, and then at the end, you sort of true up the newly taxable and TIF increments and everything. What this overall cap would do is say, okay, your bottom line after you've trued up your newly taxable and your inflation growth cannot be greater than this overall cap as compared to the prior year budget. And so it would be taxing jurisdiction specific, and voted levies would still be a way to circumvent that.
Okay, so voted levies are out of there. Like if we're going probably out for a detention levy at some point, that won't affect any of that.
Sure.
Okay. I guess that's all I have right now.
But Dylan, the cap would effectively force fast-growing counties to use some of their new growth to offset current taxpayers' taxes.
I would say the overall cap is sort of like a safety valve, is how I would think of it. It's saying, it's putting a maximum limit on what the formula can spit out. So right now there isn't that, and it's possible for a county to grow by 20%, say, if they had some massive, especially could happen in the east if they had like a large pipeline or something be built in their county. You could see very large growth in budget authority because of that. The overall cap is a safeguard against those extreme measures, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you just look at this chart right here and look at Fergus County, that's kind of an example right there where they had some significant growth in, I think, some centrally assessed properties. Fallon probably had some growth in some centrally assessed property, maybe some pipelines or something. So there's some pretty significant changes in some areas. That
Yeah,
like Fergus and Fallon, they're not growing. Strictly Fallon's not growing with new residential growth, so it's growing with other types of with growth.
So here's a simulation of 15, 10, 420, but let's just have this overall cap at 4.75 and see how that affects things. These blue things are a misnomer. It's just a rounding error essentially, but you can see that the largest effects, Fergus, like we said, some in Musselshell, Garfield County here. I will note that kind of because of the peculiarities of class 1 and class 2 property, those can have quite large swings similar to newly taxable property. When you set the mills, you back out those mine proceeds numbers, set the mill, and then add them back in. And what that can do is cause large swings from year to year.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Representative
Mr.
Furman?
Story has a question. How was the gross proceeds dealt with in your model?
Good question. So it's accounted for like it is in 15, 10, 420. So the way that gross proceeds is dealt with in 15, 10, 420 is you take your budget and then you back out the amount of money from your mill levy on class 1 and class 2 property from the prior year. So you reduce your authority by that amount. And then later, when you're figuring out how many mills to levy, you take out the taxable value associated with that class 1 and class 2 property. You set the mill, and then that mill gets levied against the mining proceeds. And what that sort of does, I think, as Mr. Story will tell you, is it prevents the county from being too reliant on that money. It sort of causes them to be agnostic about what's going on in the mine. It's sort of like it's money that they're still counting on seeing, but they don't get to take that into account whenever they set their mills. And that does have implications for this overall cap because the mining, the difference in outlook on the commodity price of a metal can drastically swing how much revenue the mine raises. And so that's why if we look at 15, 10, 420, but with an overall cap, you can see that the mining counties, Stillwater, Sweetgrass, and Butte Silverbow are the ones that see the largest decreases in their taxing authority because of that.
So, Dylan, does the population growth impact the overall growth or just the inflation factor?
If we include population growth, that affects the inflation factor, and then the overall cap would still override anything,
Right.
if that's what
Okay.
you were asking.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a possibility, I guess, you know, if we want to discuss that, you could have the population factor also maybe influence the overall growth factor too, in addition to just inflation. So,
Yep, that's certainly possible.
Representative Fern.
I think Senator Hertz, what you just said perhaps comes closer to answering my concerns. And I like an idea of a cap, but I kind of thinking back to school funding. And if your district, a larger district grew by 200 A and B, but you're only allowed to count 100, it would be problematic. It would work for a lot of districts, but then the cap would hurt some fast-growing districts that may need additional funds than the cap suggests, but not necessarily what the chart suggests. And I think perhaps there's some sweet spot that can work for different size counties and different growth rates. I think finding it is really important. And if the population increase can add on to that cap, perhaps we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, it's just so difficult from county to county. Things are so different, and a big new investment can make a significant impact on a county budget. But also I think overall it's probably good policy that you shouldn't allow a county just to get a big windfall either at the expense of the other taxpayers too. So it is difficult. And of course, the counties always have, or the cities have the right to just go to the voters and override it and say, hey, here's what we want to do. And because obviously that looks, if you look at the chart, 15, 10, 420 has done a fairly decent job of keeping the budgets at a steady growth. But the big difference between the orange and the blue is what the voters want. And that's where a lot of the increases are coming from. So it looks like Mr. Story has another question too. What would be the effect on equalization mills if they were subject to Senate Bill 511?
Great question, and who better to ask it than Mr. Story? I don't think I'm not aware of modeling that we've done on that question in particular. I assume they would be lower because that's generally the effect, that sort of the average effect of Senate Bill 511 would be a lower growth. And so I imagine that would apply to the equalization mills as well, especially the overall cap of 4.75%, I think would have a significant effect on the growth of the equalization mills.
Mr. Holmquist.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, what Senator Fern or Representative Fern and you were saying about, every county is so different. East side, west side, different taxing things that are going on. It's really hard to get to that, I guess, sweet spot to figure out how we're gonna do this, because we're all so different. We're also different and how we budget too. So just a thought. Thanks.
if I might be so bold, what I think is the value of this tool is that we can conceptualize logical things and then see how it plays out with the data to see if it accomplishes a purpose. So when 1510-420 was created, you know, there wasn't any, I don't think there was any real tool that they were finally adjusting levers to see how it changed things. They just had a mandate from the voters that property taxes were growing too fast. So they settled on half the rate of inflation. And then they said, well, we gotta have some mechanism for counties to capture new growth. So they just said, okay, 100% annuity taxable. So I think the best thing that can come out of this committee is a rationalization of whether that's right or wrong, and then you can use this tool to back up your rationalization. So that's how I see the usefulness of this idea.
Well, and I would agree with you, Dylan. Back in the day when 1510-420 was put in place, I think it has worked, but in this market of fast growth, large value increases, it's probably a tool that needs to have some adjustments done to it.
I'm not sure if this was answered, but Mr. Story asked, what would the effect on equalization mills if they were subject to the Senate Bill 511?
Yeah, we just discussed that. So we got
Okay,
that.
I wasn't
Yeah,
quite on track.
no problem. So does Senator McGilvery, you have another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, if this tool can show us the 95 mills, they're not in this 511, right? Or 1510-420, correct?
So the 95 mills are subject to 1510-420. And the state has used what is referred to as banked authority. So because there were many years where the 1510-420 calculation produced a number greater than 95, the state banked those excess mills and then draws them down in years where the 1510-420 calculation produces a number lower than 95. So Mr. Story was asking what would be the effect of subjecting those equalization mills to this alternative Senate Bill 511 framework. But we have not done analysis on what that would have looked like.
Just correct me, make sure I understand. Are the equalization mills included in the 95 mills?
Yes, Senator
Alright.
McGilvery, the equalization mills and the 95 mills are the same thing.
Well, again, just to clarify from my understanding, the equalization mills are just part of the 95, but like 40 mills or something like that.
I think there is some subtle nuanced difference between the 40 mills, the 22 mills, and the 33 mills. But for all intents and purposes, when we talk about equalization mills, we are talking about the 95 mills.
Okay, so we're talking all 95.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, thanks for the clarification. So then 1510-420 does address the 95 are included in under the law of 1510-420.
That's correct. As the law stands now, the 95 mills are subject to 1510-420.
Okay, then clarify the lawsuit for me. What was the big suit about?
So that had to do with the banked authority that I was referencing earlier. So when you do the 1510-420 calculation, you take your prior year budget, you add inflation, you take out taxes from metal mines, and that gets you your new authorized budget. And then you go through the process of figuring out how many mills you need to set to achieve that authorized budget. And what was happening from 2001 up through 2015 is that the calculation produced like 96, 97 mills in many of those years. And so the state banked those mills because that's allowable under 1510-420. If you don't levy the maximum number of mills that the calculation results in, you can tuck those mills away and use them at a later date. The question that the counties were litigating was whether it was possible for that number to actually exceed 95. And 1510-420 isn't a model of clarity, I think was the phrasing that Jarrett Coles used in his analysis of it. But that is what the Department of Revenue has consistently taken the interpretation of that statute to be, is that the state is allowed to bank those mills and use them in years when the calculation produces something less than 95. And that's what the Supreme Court reaffirmed.
So in some mills are not subject to 1510-420. In fact, in Lake County, I believe we got close to 40 mills that aren't subject to 1510-420. So it's up to the discretion of the county commissioners to decide whether they want to lower those mills as appraised values increases. And some of those were approved by the voters. I know one of them was a recreational mill. I think it was 10 mills maybe for recreational purposes. So it just depends on when those are voted on, when they're passed, whether they're subject to 1510-420 or not. That's a choice that you can put on any time when you particularly pass one of those. So Dylan, a question I had on the banked mills is a 4.75 cap under 511. Does that impact the banked mills, or could a taxing authority use their bank mills to exceed the 4.75% cap?
I think it would come down to how you wrote the law, essentially.
Okay, that's what I
The
thought.
way I'm envisioning it in my mind is that if you tried to make things as simple as possible, you wouldn't, you would allow banked mills to exceed that amount. But if you wanted to avoid that happening, I think you could rewrite the law in such a way, and the math could work out in such a way as to have that not be that.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions before I open it up to public comment? All right. Anybody out there in the attendees, if you have a comment, please raise your hand and we can get you on. Okay, I don't see anybody right now. We can circle back around. So we're doing pretty good on time. We've still got some time here until Utah's up at 2 o'clock. Does anybody want to weigh in with any thoughts, comments about maybe what we might want to do with proceeding with Senate Bill 511?
Well, I'll jump out there. I think we should run it again, and how it turns out at the end of the debate and discussion is speculative, but I think it's a good starting point, what we had last session, frankly.
Representative Fern?
Yes, I'm probably still stuck a little bit on putting some kind of population into the bill. My question is do we know how often counties ask for budget overrides by voters? Is that common? And can we project what might happen if we put a hard cap on? Would we expect to see more levy requests? I know it's just speculative, but I'm wondering, and I'm not even saying it's unintended consequences. I'm just saying it might force some things, you know? Anyone take a wild guess out there?
Yeah, I think it's less common for jurisdictions to ask voters to approve a budget higher than 1510-420 than it is to just ask for a like earmarked levy, like a new aquatic center or something like that. It's much more likely to have an issue that's given a dollar amount rather than just a dollar amount for a budget override. I do think it's, you know, as an economist who's inclined to think at the margin, if you limit the growth of counties, they're likely to be asking for more money from the voters than they would otherwise because they're entitled to less money than they would be otherwise.
Yeah. I would concur with that. And I think also what we're seeing that Commissioner Logan brought up too is special districts, where some localities are offloading general fund expenditures into a special district, which then allows them to keep growing their general fund at a higher rate than they would have allowed to under 1510-420. So that's another discussion that we need to look at those special districts and how we can maybe potentially put a cap on those also. There's always a way around a cap, Bill. People can be very creative.
You know, I think most of the time counties, you know, I guess I can only speak for myself, but I've watched some others that try to stay within their budget. And then if there's something extra or additional, they usually give the voters a chance to weigh in on that through a voted levy or whatever. But I don't know, I guess I've seen 1510-420 work so well through the years. I have a hard time letting go of it, I guess, because it has worked really well for us. And we're all different. And so a little concerned with the chart because it looks like under 511, we'll get less taxes from what I was seeing on some. I know we can move the numbers around, but it looks like even though it's 4%, and we've only done 3.36 for the last 10 years, it looks like we'll actually have less money. So I'm not sure quite how that's working, but a little troublesome. So
I'm kind of inclined to agree with Pam. I think that 511 might be too restrictive, and I agree with Dave that we may be inviting more opportunities for special levy requests. Smaller counties have experienced the same relative increases in their expenses as larger counties. They just don't have the growth and they don't have the new construction to help build their budgets. And so I think I don't want to put them all behind the 8 ball any more than they are already.
But Senate Bill 511 would actually help those smaller counties because it would give them the full rate of inflation capped at 4% instead of the half the rate. So that's particularly since they don't have any new growth. Although they might get caught in a new pipeline coming in, and then all of a sudden that new growth has to be used to help reduce property taxes too. So, and on Pam's questions too, Dylan, it might just be the way they're negatively impacted is because of the new growth and not using all of it to grow their budget, but to offset existing taxpayers. Might that be a possibility up there in Flathead?
Yeah, I'm not, I guess, 100%, you know, like Pam has said multiple times, everybody kind of budgets differently. So I'm not quite sure what exactly Flathead is doing, but yeah, I don't know. I can't off the top of my head say why the model is predicting something that Pam doesn't think it should.
Well, I know Flathead County, just looking at the numbers up there, they've been very conservative with their budget growth versus some of the other larger counties in the state. So that's why their tax increases have been somewhat less than other counties. Senator McGilvery?
I just have a definition question about new growth. When is new growth not new growth? Is it just 1 year, or does that new growth stay new growth for a while, or how do we define that?
So it's only new growth in the first year. The way it works is, so again, because you take that new growth out when you set the mill levy, but that mill levy then applies to that new growth, and then it's sort of baked into the pie after that, because that new growth is then part of the next year's budget, which gets the inflation adjustment added to it. And then there's another cycle of new growth, and then that gets baked in. So essentially, what I think the easiest way for me to think about new growth is you just pretend like it doesn't exist when you set the tax base. So your mill value is artificially high, and then that extra money that you received is then baked into all future inflationary adjustments.
So is it correct to say the new growth never gets captured in the inflation calculation? I mean, it just keeps adding to the pie.
Well, it's a one-time adjustment every time there's new growth. It will get counted in inflation in future years.
But
I'm not
that,
sure.
that 1 year of inflation, 1 year of new growth never gets counted. It just adds on, and then you calculate inflation from there every time, every year. So it would essentially, adding that new growth allows the bottom line, it allows the revenue stream to grow much more rapidly.
That's true, yes. Because you don't have to, I mean, so the conversely, let's say if you only allowed 50% of new growth, that means 50% of the new taxable value is pulling the mills down for all the existing property, and 50% is continuing to be levied at that same mill rate. So I think that's sort of what Senator Hertz has been calling buying down mills. When you allow less than 100% newly taxable to be removed from 1510-420, what that implicitly does is it buys down the mills for existing property.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, the new growth is kind of like compound interest, Senator McGilvery.
Yeah.
And obviously we all know with compound interest, your investment is going to grow a lot faster than without it. So, Rhonda, you have a question, comment? Go ahead and unmute yourself. Nancy, can you see about unmuting Rhonda Wiggers?
There we go. Sorry about that.
All right.
I guess I need to, can we go back to the chart that showed what happened if we implemented the map that showed what happened if we implemented 511?
Yeah,
So,
let me change the
yeah.
and so again, 511 had 50% of new growth, full inflation with a cap at 4% on that inflation, and then an overall cap of 4.75%.
So I guess I'm not understanding how any county was kept whole, with the exception of the blue counties, if the taxes go down to each residential property owner. I'm still understanding we floated everything in here. So the float should have happened, but if the taxes go down to each residential property owner, are the counties not losing money in this process? And I guess my concern is I don't hold with the belief that all of our counties are just willy-nilly wasting money out there. I disagree with some of the ways some counties are spending money, but I don't live in those counties. And I'm a little concerned that we made a promise 20 some years ago to these counties that if they would send all their revenue sources to the state, that we would let them share in the property tax surpluses, and I don't, or in the income tax surpluses. And I'm not sure I'm okay taking some of these rural counties or these counties and saying we're cutting what you have to work with, because they're struggling to get employees now for what they can afford to pay.
Sure.
So is there a way that, can you tell me how the counties were kept whole in this process?
So the counties are not being kept whole in this process. What this is saying is the implicit assumption in here is that we're monkeying with the levers of 15, 10, 420, and what happens happens. So the counties in red would have less budget authority under Senate Bill 511 than they would under 15, 10, 420. That's what this map is showing.
Okay, that's what I thought. And I'm not sure that I'm opposed. I'm not sure I'm for it either, but I am a little concerned that, and I realize that with term limits, nobody in the legislature now made that promise, but I was here when we made that promise to the counties, and I am sadly living my testimony out that said that the state wouldn't keep their end of the deal, and I'm concerned about cutting the counties too much more.
You aren't alone in those lobbying efforts.
Thank
So,
you, Rhonda.
yeah.
I agree.
So one of our objectives here, as to remind people, is the taxpayer. That's what we're here to do. We're here to slow down the growth of taxes for the taxpayer or reduce them. And unlike the homestead and comstead exemption, which is shifting taxes from one taxpayer to another, this is not. And you're right, it's basically lowering the taxes and reducing the amount of overall revenue under the base 1510 420 Senate Bill 511. But the other option out there is you still go to voters if you want more, and you can ask your voters. So.
But that's the assumption that the counties have too much money.
No, I wouldn't say that it's the assumption that counties have too much money.
I hear it all the time from every legislator out there.
Not for me. I mean, what I'm hearing is taxpayers are saying they don't like their property taxes. And the first thing I tell them is most of your property taxes are coming from things you're voting for.
Yeah.
So if you don't like your taxes, quit voting for all these different levies.
Well, I tell them the same thing, but that educating the local individual on how taxes work, all they know is they write the check to the county and the county's getting all the money. That's all they know. And so it makes that's the mantra, right? Even though it's not true, even though it's, it is what it is. But then when all the elected officials say the same thing, well, the counties are charging too much, then this is where we end up. And it's unfortunate because it does lessen most every county out there 511. So
Senator Hertz, could I offer something in addition that I know it's not in 511, but and this is going back to the fact, and I hate that we call it the entitlement, because honestly, this was a hard fought battle 20 some years ago, that if the counties would just send all these different revenue sources to the state would then, and the state did take district court from the counties that were struggling with district court. So I need to say that up front. But the counties would, the state would then make them whole. We could look at a process of not only, if you're going to implement 511 to make the property taxpayers happy, those same taxpayers are not going to be happy when they call for the sheriff's department and nobody shows up. They're not going to be happy when their roads aren't plowed. They're not going to be happy when a number of other things happen, or their home insurance goes up because we shut down fire departments. Those things all happen on the other side that are long, they don't see the results. But what if we changed the way we give what we call the entitlement to the counties and change that formula to backfill into the counties the same way that we do schools? So more of the income tax was going directly to the counties, and adjusted that formula along with that. That would lower the property taxes for the property taxpayers still, but it would then still make the counties be able to have fire departments and roads and the things that we count on, someone to take let us license our vehicles. So what if we change that entitlement fee and amount along with this? Would that make it more appealing?
That possibly could, but here's our problem. So then what you're saying is take general fund dollars and push them back to local governments for property taxes. Well, our general fund right now, it seems like the number is 85 to 90% of that is already going to education, medication, and incarceration. So you start robbing too much of the general fund, then we're going to have to start reducing the biggest portion of those are those three items that I just talked about. So it's really a balancing act what we're trying to do here.
This would be
Um,
the time to plug sales tax, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the people of Montana have told us they do not want a statewide sales tax, and so if that's what they don't want, then we're going to have to live with what we have. So, Senator or Representative Story, you've had your hand up. You haven't had a chance to weigh in here lately.
Yeah, I was going to comment when you asked for public comment, but for some reason I wasn't connecting. On the 511 issue, I think the model's great in that it lets you at least analyze, what you want to do with newly taxable property and inflation and those types of things. There was no magic to the half the rate of inflation in 2001 when that went into the 1510-420 law. It was just halfway between full inflation that local governments wanted and zero inflation that the voters passed in 98. So it's been there. There's been a lot of attempts to raise it, and it's never just made it through the legislative process. I think if you're gonna replace 1510-420 with 511, you need to address the banked mills at the same time, whether you even want to have banked mills or not. I don't know how many are out there other than the states. I'm sure there's some counties have a few bank mills, but I would guess most of the bank mills set on the state levies, on the equalization levies. I just soon probably, if you're going to change the law and go to full inflation and that, maybe just not allow for any more bank mills. But if you are going to allow for bank mills, you need to bank dollars and not mills, so that if you bank a mill that's worth $1,000 today and you cash it in one that's worth $1,500, that's kind of the way it works right now.
Yeah.
I think you'll probably have a discussion later about whether voted levies should be mills or dollars, but I think most of us are hoping that they all just become a dollar levy, so that will keep some of the growth in taxes down, just because you won't be collecting more money every time you have a reappraisal and new property and all of that. Then new property will drive down the mill levies for those voted levies, and yeah, I think as this bill progresses in the legislature, the discussion about what percentages of different classes of property should be new revenue and what percentage should be tax relief is an appropriate discussion to have there. I think Dylan did a great job of explaining the court case on the statewide mills, but I would encourage you to have the department run this same analysis against the, because under 1510-420, even without bank mills, if you the equalization mills under 511, say if you did like everyone else, they would grow at full inflation every year. They would grow at some population growth. The state would have to give back some of its newly taxable property and tax relief, and they wouldn't get a windfall every time you did a reappraisal. And so, I think if you did that same analysis for the state that you did for the counties and saw what those lines looked like, you'd be surprised what the state revenue line looks like compared to the city and county revenue lines. It would be pretty steep above those lines, just because you're taking every dollar worth of reappraised value and tax and that, and you're taking the inflation, and you're taking all the new property. So the only reason the state was banking mills at all was because they couldn't collect over 95, and when you had newly taxable property and a reappraisal going on that wasn't mitigated, you had big changes in the taxable value of the state. Yeah, what Rhonda was talking about, that's a big bite to take off, just to try to come in and lever some of the income tax money away from the state to help local governments. But former legislator and former Department of Revenue Director and former Missoula Mayor Mike Cadis made that suggestion back in 2000 when we were working on this. It said, you know, the state does all kinds of things in the property tax system to encourage economic growth in the state. And a lot of that economic growth generates income tax money. It doesn't generate property tax revenues to speak of. And they were hoping for some way that the state would share a little of that growth back with the counties. And some of that was done through the growth factors on the vehicles and the alcohol and the gaming and stuff that have been adjusted quite a bit since then. But I think your discussion on and your analysis on going with the 511 method, at least you have some numbers that compare what it is to the current situation. I think the map, as the chairman has told you, basically shows you what the taxpayer benefit of mainly using new property to reduce, or a portion of new property to reduce tax levies are. And you can see that why in Valley County and some of those counties where you don't have a lot of new property, you don't see that tax relief coming, because, you know, they just don't have much there to offset. I am a little concerned about how it works with the net and gross proceeds in the three counties that have active mines going on, but you know, that may cause some need for, again, voted levies. But I think if you go to full inflation, that's going to get you halfway to dealing with some of the issues of why you have to have voted levies to try to keep up with the cost of providing services. With that, thanks for the opportunity to make a few comments.
Thank you, Mr. Story. So if everybody else could hold your questions, we have time later today on the agenda to get back to this, because right now it's 2:00 and Nancy is Matthew Hurst with Utah Tax Commission. Is he up and available and ready to
He
give
is
us-
available.
Great. So perfect. I see you, Matthew, on the Zoom screen. So today, you know, we invited you here to just kind of give us a little bit of information on how the Utah Truth in Taxation Law works. So I'll turn it over to you if you need to share your screen or anything. I'm sure Nancy can help us out with that.
Yeah, I was planning on sharing my screen if I could do that.
Sure.
I don't see that. Oh, there we go.
We can see it.
Can you
Perfect.
screen? Okay, I'll get this started. So just listening to your conversations, sounds like we have a similar process in setting tax rates. And again, my name is Matt Hurst. I work for the Property Tax Division for the Utah State Tax Commission. We certify all the rates, and actually that's what we're doing this week. So we're setting all the tax rates for all of our entities. And what we do is we take the entity's revenues and we collect the new year's taxable property values for all the entities to come up with tax rates. And what our tax rate does is it provides the same amount of revenue that they had the year before. And we do have a new growth adjustment. So we add revenue based on what the assessors have marked as new growth. So just an example of, say we had a city that had a $5,000 budget and their property value was 2.5 million. Their tax rate would be 0.002. And let's say the following year, or so the entity's budget would be coming from these, let's say 10 homes and one business. And that would make their entity collect the 5,000 that they were able to charge. The next year, if the assessors were to reappraise the value of the homes and the business, and the entity's taxable value went up to 2.8 million, the tax rate would come down to ensure that they get the same amount of revenue. So just because the value went up doesn't mean the revenue collects more money. We would adjust their rate down so that they would collect the same amount of revenue. And this leads to if an entity does need more revenue, we have the truth in taxation, which is what we've nicknamed our process of collecting more revenue. So if the values went up and the rates went down, they wanted to collect on the same tax rate, they would have to go through this process. And it's an increase because they are collecting more budgeted revenue by using the same rate. If the calculation that we do lowers their tax rate. And that's in our tax code. We specifically have it in 59.2.919 of our Utah code annotated. So when you need more revenue, or the entities need more revenue than what the certified tax rate would generate, they go through this process and they're noticing requirements to the taxpayers. Mainly the tax increase hearing. And depending on what type of entity you are, there are different timelines, but the tax increase hearing must be held at 6 p.m. And the taxpayers must be given a reasonable amount of time for public comment. These hearings are for all the entities, and so they can't be on the same day if they have an overlapping, let's say a city and a school district are doing a tax increase hearing, that can't be held on the same night. And then any meetings that entity has that day must end before the hearing. The entities are required to post this notice in the newspaper as an ad. It shows what the increase would be on the average residential value, and we use that as well as on a business of the same value. We give our residents a 45% residential exemption. So that's why those amounts are different. But then we also have them put the percent increase of what their budget will be with the increase. They also post this ad on a few different websites in our state, Utah Legals, Utah Public Notice website, which is for all public meetings, and then on their county and entity websites. And then just the different timelines I wanted to show. If they're a calendar year entity, so their budget runs from January 1st to December 31st. These are typically counties. Their process starts the year before. While they're setting their budget, they're required to send out a specific notice to each parcel owner of the similar things that are in the newspaper ad. So the date, time, and location of the hearing, how much the increase would be specifically to their property. They do the advertising, so the newspaper ad for the hearing. They hold the hearing and then adopt the additional revenue that they've proposed by the end of the year. And then June 8th is when we do their new tax rate and add the revenue to their tax rate that they've approved through this process. And by June 22nd, they adopt the final rate. For our schools and cities, their fiscal year. So we set their certified tax rate June 8th, and then during their June meeting, they adopt a proposed rate. If it's an increased rate, then with the notice of valuation that goes out July 22nd, the date, time, and location of the hearing is posted on that value that goes to each parcel owner. And then, of course, they've got their newspaper ads. And in August is when they have all the tax increase hearings and adopt their final rates in September or by September 1st. So that's just an overview. I don't know if you had any questions or that I can.
Yeah, that's great. Is there a cap at all on how much a locality can raise their rates?
There's no cap. There is a certain caps on tax rates for certain types of entities. Like a county can't go over a certain amount.
Okay.
Schools have different ones. Yeah, so there's caps where you can get to, but where we've seen the increase in values, they're getting further and further away from their caps.
And my understanding is all of your levies mills float up and down, although it sounds like there was an exception recently that the state has some mills that are no longer floating. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did have a statewide school basic levy that was frozen for 5 years. And yeah, in 2022, when we had the big increase in values, we saw a lot of extra revenue from that.
Okay. And it looks like, is the tax rate applied to all classes of property the same, or do you guys have, I mean, like a business pays the same rate as a residential, et cetera?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any mechanism where voters can petition the locality that we don't like your proposed rate increase and we want the public to be able to vote on it? Is there anything in law that allows you guys to do that?
Yeah, so there is a referendum process, which they would have to get so many signatures in that district. And then it would have to go to the ballot and be voted on, the increase. And actually, we've seen 2 or 3 of those each year in the last few years that actually reversed the increase.
And when do you guys print and publish your property taxes? I mean, in Montana, our property tax bills come out in generally October 1st and November. They're due in November 30th. And then also May 31st. Is that similar to you guys, or what's your timetable on paying taxes?
Yeah, so the bills are sent November 1st and are due November 30th. Personal property is usually due in May.
Okay. So you don't have on a real property, is it you have to pay it all in one lump sum? or do you get it split it?
It's all one lump sum.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And then that's the same with centrally assessed. The centrally assessed gets billed and collected by the counties.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions? I see, Rhonda, do you have a question on this, or is that from the previous discussion we were having?
Sorry, just forgot to put my hand down.
Okay. Mr. Story, you have a question?
Yeah, I think when he was explaining how the taxes were different on a house than a business because there's an exemption. Could you hit that again?
Yeah, so if it's the primary residence of the owner or somebody, then that home would qualify for an exemption of 45%. So the taxable value on that property would be 55% of the market value.
But all other properties at market, then how do you do ag land? How do you do
Yes,
ag land?
except for greenbelt or farmland. We call it the Farmland Assessment Act, where if it's being farmed or you're running cattle on it or something, there would be a reduction in taxable value.
What about residential rental property? Does that have any exemptions?
Yes, if it's the home for the renter, then that would qualify as well.
Okay.
Residential exemption.
Okay. Commissioner Logan.
Thank you. So, how long have your truth in taxation laws been in effect?
I believe they started in 1986.
So, so it's quite a while ago.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you probably don't have any sense then of what public participation was like before as compared to after the laws went into effect.
No, that's
Yeah.
it's before I was born.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Commissioner Holmquist.
Yeah, I was just curious how the sales tax fits into this and what portion do the counties and cities get of the sales tax?
Yeah, well, so the cities charge the sales tax more than any, so the schools don't get any sales tax. The counties might get a small portion of sales tax, but most don't charge a sales tax.
So what you're saying is, you have a statewide general sales tax, but a city can elect a higher tax.
Yes, most of the sales tax is city-based.
Okay,
And then if it's not in a city, then it would go to the county.
okay. Cindy Johnson?
Are there special voted levies in Utah where the voters can elect to tax themselves more for special purposes?
Yes, but I'm thinking maybe one or two that we've had in the last 5 years. And it's usually for a time frame, say like 5 years. We do have general obligation bonds that are voted on, but the way we calculate those, it's revenue based, and so we're just paying back what the bond payments are based
Okay.
on values for each year.
Thanks.
So what if a city wanted to build a new fire hall? Do they go to the voters for that, or is that generally done within the budget?
I've seen it both ways. They can increase their tax rates, or they can go do a geo bond.
Okay,
But the geo bond would have to be voted on.
where the tax rate would not have to be unless the citizens petitioned it to be voted on.
Right, yep.
All right. Representative Fern, did you you had your hand up now? I see it's
Yeah,
down.
we're considering a model that might differentiate a large population of value anyways of short-term rentals and secondary homes. Do you have similar policy in Utah?
So if it's a secondary home, they wouldn't qualify for the residential value and they're taxed at 100% of the market value. Other than that, we don't have any different treatment for those.
Do you have any idea the value of those second type homes in the state, or a percentage of the total makeup?
Well, we do collect that data, but I'm not off the top of my head, no.
Okay, thank you.
So I imagine you must have quite a bit with all your ski resort areas.
Yeah,
So
so there's
a lot of
pockets,
residents.
right? You've got Park City has a lot of secondary, St. George area
Mhm.
down by the national parks, quite a few.
Yeah. On your exemption, your 45% exemption on residential property, does that have any a cap on it at all? So if I have a $400,000 home, I get 45%, or if I got a $4 million home, I get 45%.
Yep. There's no cap on it.
Right. How do you prove, is there a certification each year or periodically that this is a personal residence?
Yes, yeah. So they would apply to the county each year.
Do you guys, when you appraise property, is that the county level versus the state level?
Yes, so all real property and personal property is done at the local county level.
Yeah.
And then centrally assessed is done by another group in the property tax division.
Do you see much of a problem with different valuations from county to county, or are everybody kind of using the same valuation book to get to a value?
Well, so just recently they passed a law for all of the counties to be on the same appraisal system, software. So they're all moving into that software now,
Okay.
but they should be on similar valuation methods.
Ms. Story, you got another question?
Yeah, so when you were first explaining how the tax rate's set, then basically all new property generates lower levies. Is that the way it works then?
Yeah, so we subtract out the new growth value out of that bottom number of taxable value for the first year. And then when that gets charged to the normal tax rate, that's new revenue. So we take 100% of that as new growth.
Okay.
Unless it's in, let's say, a project area for tax increment financing, it would go to that project instead of to the entity.
So I misunderstood that then when you first explained it. That it looked to me like all new property didn't generate new revenue, but the way it works, you take the new property out and generate the tax rate and then apply that tax rate to new property.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a very simple example, and there are some adjustments we make to that taxable value. One is for the new growth. We make a appeal adjustment and a collection adjustment.
Okay, so then the following year, then you pull that new growth into your revenue. So let's say the first year you have $1 million of normal revenue plus 100,000 of new growth revenue, which isn't counted. And then, but then the next year, you're starting at 1.1 million of revenue to set your tax rates. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Cindy, you got another question?
I do, thanks. So if the secondary residences are taxed at market value, how do you handle homes that are owned by farming LLCs or family farming corporations?
Well, if it's being used as farmland, then it could qualify as a farmland assessment. And the value would be reduced based on the production tables. Say we're producing wheat or corn, there's different production metrics you have to meet in order to qualify for the exemption. But as far as owner type, I don't think we do anything
Doesn't matter.
based on who owns the property.
Okay, thanks.
So your key there, as long as as long as it's somebody's residence, they're gonna get that 45% exemption.
Yes.
Okay.
I had one more question about related to newly taxable. So when you revalue the property, how often do you reappraise residential and properties?
So they reappraise it every year.
Okay, so when you get say a 15% increase in value across the board from reappraisal, that's really not taxable, right? That's what drives the tax rate down.
Yeah, so theoretically, if the values go up because of reappraisal 15%, the rate should come down 15%. There's a few other factors that go into it, so it's not always 1-to-1.
Yeah, I assume, you have residential and commercial and centrally assessed, they all grow at different rates. And so it's a composite total growth of the taxable value of the jurisdiction drives the rate down.
Right. Yeah, so it really depends on
Absent new property. Yeah. All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? See, you still got your hand up there, Mr. Story. I assume you're done. Okay. Anybody else have any questions at all in the committee before we let Mr. Hurst go? Well, certainly appreciate taking the time today, Matt, and very informative.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
You should be good.
All right. So that's very interesting. What's going on there? But Ralph and Mr. Story and myself had an opportunity to not talk to Mr. Hurst previously, but we talked to the Utah Taxpayers Association, and they kind of went through the same way. I think we got a little more detail today as to exactly what they do with like new growth, and a little more information on their homestead exemption too, which was interesting. But of course, we all have to keep in mind that Utah has a statewide sales tax too, which helps a lot of that revenue offset. But what's interesting too is their tax rates are all the same for all their taxpayers, which in Montana, as we all know, I mean, right now residential has one of the lowest tax rates. And we got commercial people paying 5, 6, 7, 8 times the rate that residential taxpayers are paying right now. Sounds like their agriculture rates are very similar to ours. They're using production, some type of production value. So
Don't forget our many data centers, Senator.
what's that?
Don't forget our many data centers with that.
That's
Very
yeah.
Hey, no, they're popping up all over the place.
Yeah. Well, and Utah has quite the diverse economy down there too. With they still have mining. I mean, they got one heck of a tourism economy down there. Their ski resorts, their second home areas that have really grown in that Park City area in St. George and all over down there. So somewhat similar to Montana, though. I would say a lot of their economy is somewhat similar. So, I don't know, anybody got any general thoughts or comments on the truth in taxation? I mean, I had somewhat of a similar bill last session. Well, it passed and it's in law, but local govs are they say they're having a hard time implementing it. And basically my bill was basically said, when you're setting your preliminary budget, you need to tell the taxpayer how much their taxes are going to go up on a 100, 300, and a $600,000 home. Well, you know, they're all saying they can't do that because they don't get certified values until August. And, you know, I'm pushing back and just saying, well, just estimate what it is. It's not going to be that far off, because certified values generally aren't that far off from the preliminary values. I mean, usually they get pushed one way or the other due to some maybe significant appeals, but generally most places don't have that unless you're in something with a pretty large centrally assessed taxpayer who might be making a significant appeal. All right. Does any other comments or thoughts on Utah's truth in taxation before we put that aside? No, okay. I mean, I kind of like that. I had that teed up at the last session to bring that bill forward, but kind of ran out of time and we had a lot of other issues going on. I know there's several other states out there looking at Utah's, just their law. I mean, 1510, 420 kind of does, you know, the similar. We have all the notice information that you have to put out there for your property taxes and your budget hearings, etc. But it's probably not as detailed as to what are your taxes going to go up on the proposed budget. So, all right, well, I guess we will leave that subject. And so now let's circle back around to our work session on Senate Bill 511, and a number of people had their hands up. If you still have a question, it seemed like Mr. Eggers, seemed like you had your hand up still when we left. Maybe Mr. Story and a few others, maybe. And so Senator McGilvery's got his hand up there, so we'll go to you.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. I just wanted to circle back to the taxes in lieu of payment that Rhonda brought up. It seems like there's a legislative fiscal division chart that has some objective measure of, did the counties get what they were promised, or have they been getting more than they were promised? Is anybody familiar with that?
So,
Dylan?
yeah, I actually do the entitlement share calculation every year, so I guess I'm probably one of the better people to talk to this. So I am familiar with what you're referencing, Senator McGilvery. I think what that chart shows is that the revenues that the counties gave up in the big bill have stayed generally fairly flat over the last 20 odd years, while the entitlement share growth notches up by about 3% a year. I think one of the reasons for that, if nothing else, is that the like vehicle registration, for example, was one of the larger revenue sources that was given up. That's a dollar amount, not a percentage or anything, and that dollar amount hasn't been changed in 20 years. So there are, I think, reasons and explanations why the revenues are flat, but I would say it's an unfair characterization to say that the state is giving less than what was promised back at the time when the switch was made.
So let me clarify, maybe phrase the question this way. In your judgment, looking at the chart, are the counties better off or worse off than they would have been if they had not given up the revenue?
I don't know if I'm willing to make that much of a value statement. There were other things associated with that, like the state taking over district court. That was a pretty substantial financial burden that the state took on. Although they did reduce entitlement money as in counties as a result of that burden they took on. But I believe the costs of district court have far outstripped the revenues from fees that district court generates to the state.
What
I'll
about
look-
Office of
I'll look-
Public, what about Office of Public Defender? Is that in that calculation? Because that didn't even exist back then.
I'm not familiar enough to speak on that either.
I guess I would just like to have some objective standard to measure what was suggested, that the counties are getting short end of the stick on this deal. Because I don't know, but I would like to know. I would like to have some objective way to measure that.
Okay, it looks like Mr. Story has his hand up, who's probably an expert on this subject matter. One comment before he starts talking, I think it might depend on where you live at too, in which county or city. Because some of the revenue that they gave up and pushed back to the state might have been generated at higher amounts in a Gallatin, Flathead, or Missoula County versus a rural county. So some counties might have been better off than other counties. So I don't, Mr. Story, what do you have the?
Yeah, I think first I would just discourage it from going back and trying to reinvent that wheel. I mean, that is past, and you know, to try to reconstruct it is just going to be difficult and cause all kinds of havoc in places you don't intend. But Dylan was correct. I mean, the biggest chunk of money was motor vehicle money. And back in the history of that time, every time the legislature met, they reduced the taxes on motor vehicles because they were an ad valorem tax at that time, like about 2% of the market value of a vehicle. So people were upset then about their vehicle taxes, just like they're about property taxes. Now you were paying, $1,000 a year to license a car in 2000. And so then the legislature put on the ballot the flat fee structure that we have now went into effect like in 2002. So the motor vehicle thing was all in flux that time. But once all the vehicle revenue came to the state quit messing with motor vehicle revenue. Because anything you took out of there came out of the general fund. Now it didn't come out of the cities and counties and the school districts revenue stream. And so that issue got solved. The next biggest one, like gaming revenue, which was mainly a city revenue, and that's grown pretty, that was flat back when the cities in 2000, the cities were kind of happy to get rid of that and lock in what they had for revenue at that time, because they didn't think it was going to grow any. But if you look at what gaming revenue has done over the last 20 years, it's grown pretty substantially. And so,
yeah, the
city and the counties don't get much gaming revenue, but the city's base for the gaming revenue was like 2099 or 2000, and then it had a growth factor that kind of simulated what the revenue stream was doing. Well, I think that one, the state revenue stream, outgrew. But Dylan was correct. I mean, the counties probably made out best on the big bill because they gave up district courts, welfare. Public defender came along and the state took that over. So some of the big ticket items that really counties had no control over, because they were all driven by state laws and the Constitution, transferred to the state, and the entitlement shares were adjusted to somewhat to deal with that. But as Senator McGilvery is well aware, what happened with public defender once it became a state program rather than a county program, where if you landed in a little county and got charged with a felony, they went out and found a lawyer that wasn't working, and that was your defender. Now you got public defenders in the state and their state employees and on all the things that go with that. So the cost of that went up. District courts, we were really concerned in that the disparity in funding in district courts between counties at that time, and eventually a district judge was going to issue a order to a county to fund the court adequately, and again, counties had no way of dealing with that because they were at that time under I-105, which was more restrictive than 1510-420. So there are just a lot of things done in that bill that, you know, separated state functions from local functions, especially in the criminal justice system and welfare, and tried to align the revenue to deal with that, you know. And what happened, you know, nobody could predict what the growth factors were going to be, and the legislature has changed them from a little bit over time. So, I mean, I think that's just a point, you know, you can debate forever and not really get anywhere, especially if you start thinking about, well, the state got shorted on this and needed to withhold more of that. That's just a property tax increase at the local level anyway, you know. So I just say don't spend too much time there. Just try to, what you're doing now is a good thing, talking about ways to put some structural limits on how fast property taxes can grow that are reasonable for both the taxpayer and the governments that have to provide service, knowing full well that the state is headed toward not being controlled by any of this, and so the equalization mills will be 95 mills on whatever the tax base is, and the school levies, which are not, you know, another 50% of your tax bill, are controlled by another statute that grows at about 3% a year too. So, you know, you're working with less than half the property tax revenue here, and you know, how much effort you want to put into it other than some of the things you're doing, I don't know.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Holmquist.
Yes. So yeah, just some thoughts on that. Yeah, you mentioned the district court judges and that, and yes, the state picks up the salaries of all of that, but then the counties have to provide the space, which isn't cheap. The other part of that was the motor vehicle, and I, you know, I don't know, that I wasn't back when the big bill was going on, but in motor vehicle in Flathead County, we send over $3 million to the state every quarter, and all we get back is it's roughly 70,000, which basically is our credit card fees. And they used to pay for our paper, and they don't do that anymore. And now they're changing the system at the state level. I hear this year they've got a new system. They're getting rid of Merlin. And when that happens, they're saying to us, well, now you're going to have to fund your computers too. So right now we're using state computers, but we're sending over $3 million a quarter to the state. So I would think the state could send us some computers. But anyway, that's just one of the things, just for everybody's information as we're talking about all this, because we still have to provide the space for all of that. We are a little bit of an anomaly because in Flathead County, we have not passed a tax on motor vehicle. I think there was only 2 counties in the state that don't add a tax to a motor vehicle license. And at some point, I don't know if we would have to do that. I know it brings in a lot of money to some of the counties, but it's a tough thing to go to the voter for more tax, right? So anyway, that's just it, little information.
Rhonda.
Just to clarify, I definitely was not suggesting that you undo the big bill. That would be a job that cannot be done. That's toothpaste that cannot go back in that tube. I just wanted us to be aware that I do wish we didn't call it entitlement, because I listened to legislators say, and we're giving the counties their entitlement. Like it's something that we're not partners in this, that there isn't a partnership between state and local government. And as Commissioner Holmquist pointed out, there's so many things that the state and local government do together that we completely forget about at the legislature because they happen in different committees. You know, laws that the state passes that the local government sheriff's department has to enforce, that we put in our county jails and hold those people until they go to the state. And running the district courts together where one provides the building. So mostly what I was just throwing out was if we want to lower property taxes, and we can't figure out a way to do that. And it is a tough spot to be in. I know that our constituents feel their property taxes are too high, but the challenge we have if we, and I did go back and pull out the book we got the very first day of this meeting that talks about where our property taxes really fall. And, you know, there's only 19 states that have them lower than we do. And out of those 19 states, almost all of them have a sales tax. So in fact, I think all of them do. Maybe New Hampshire might be the outlier, and but their property taxes are astronomical. So I was throwing that out kind of as an option, that changing the way we do that entitlement percentage might be something we look at that could lower property taxes. And it may be something like picking up, instead of doing that, picking up some costs in motor vehicle or some of those other places, because the counties really don't have anywhere to go out for fees. I noticed that, I think it was the city of Billings, they said they're raising their utility fees to pay for their general fund. Well, counties can't do that because they don't have a water district or a sewer district or all those other fees to charge. So I just wanted us to be aware that hiring a county attorney costs the same whether I mean, no matter what, attorneys want more money. Everybody, the road department, those road graders aren't charged cheaper because you're Yellowstone County than because you're Pend Oreille County. They want the same amount of money for a road grader. So some of those expenses I just wanted us to be aware of. And I was kind of throwing the idea of changing the entitlement out there just because it was a place to come up with new revenue besides looking at another property taxpayer to just shift it from one property taxpayer to another, or shorting the county so that they can't maintain roads. So I did want to let Mr. Story know that although that I lost that battle 20 some years ago and do not intend to wage that battle ever again. So I don't think it can be put back. And there are, as was pointed out, some of those fees we've just left alone, and that's why they didn't go up and down. So it's really hard to tell who's winning and losing for Senator McGilvery's comments. I actually tried to keep track of it for about 10 years, thinking I was going to be able to prove something out of it. And those numbers are impossible to calculate because we've just changed the law too many times in the last 20 years to try to figure out where we would be. You can't do it. So that was just my thought. And I hope we find a way to lower the taxes a little bit without cutting the counties to the point that they can't provide services.
Great point. Well, I hope Billings isn't planning on raising their utility fees to offset general fund, or they'll find themselves in court again for the last time they charged some illegal fees related to a water and sewer district. But no, I think Ms. Story made a good point. I think the only thing is, like, gambling revenue have just gone off the charts from back when it started. And I think that's one probably legitimate area, although as Senator McGilvery pointed out too, cost of public defenders has gone off the charts too since the state took it over, and now we're paying for buildings and wages and retirement benefits and everything else that we were just contracting those services out in the past. But it's interesting, and I think Commissioner Holmquist, you have a good point. If I probably need to talk to somebody at appropriations about, you know, if using state probably should provide funding for computer systems when it comes to motor vehicle division, unless you're using those computers for something else, which you're probably not. They're probably just dedicated to the motor vehicle department.
Yeah, well, they're paying for them right now, but the new bill, the new system, they say they won't pay for them. So it's going to fall to us. So
yeah. All right. Does anybody else have any thoughts on Senate Bill 511? We kind of left that, and a few hands up. I think we pretty well covered that. Representative Fern.
Thank you, Senator. One final question for Dylan. Were you able to create a map that would include a nominal differential for population increase to see if it maybe even smooths it out a little better to meet some of the concerns brought up.
Representative Fern, do you mean like, I guess, keeping under 1510-420, but including population, or keeping the SB 511 framework and including population? I guess I'm not quite sure what you're
I'm
asking.
sorry. It would be keeping 511. It's a slight modification on 511. You know, I'm hearing both good and a lot of good about 511 and some concerns about it, whether that slight population differentiation would meet some of the needs being out there.
Yeah, so that is something that this map plays with. So I mean, I don't know, get this imprint in your mind, I guess, or focus on your home county of Flathead. So under 511, Flathead is looking at a slight revenue authority decrease, and if we allowed the adjustment for population, even under those same assumptions of 511, which were less generous newly taxable growth with full inflation and overall caps, the adjustment for population seems to increase Flathead's revenue authority under those criteria.
So maybe this subcommittee would want to just move 511 forward with, you know, some caveats, things to think about. And when there's a bill put together, you know, it's sort of like a la carte. This may be something that, you know, could be added to it, or maybe it would be included in a bill. I don't know. I mean, I think the idea of 511 is pretty sound. I mean, obviously you kind of want to get rid of, you'd like to get rid of as many red counties as possible. That's what I guess I'm calling flattening out. And again, you don't want to, I mean, Senator Hertz has said, you know, if you drift away from this too much, you're going against the whole purpose of trying to look at, you know, taxpayer liability. And I get that. I'm just reminded a lot of that liability has been said is that voted on levies. And maybe this map would also, you know, we look at the growth curve. So the growth curve would come closer together, possibly. So, you know, maybe there's just some recommendations moving forward.
So, and I think when you look at this map and those red places are obviously spots where you've got something going on with either centrally assessed or some type of commercial property. And if you allowed not to had a different amount of new commercial type property that stayed with the county, those red ones might disappear. But also, when you compare what a taxpayer on a residential home in Fallon County is paying versus what somebody else might pay in a Lewis and Clark, Missoula, Flathead, or Valley County, a lot of those people over there are not paying very much in property taxes because their budgets are getting covered by a lot of this centrally assessed and commercial type properties, whether it's pipelines, et cetera. A lot of their taxes too. I looked at like the 95 mills typically averages about 10 to 15% across on your tax bill. But you go on the east side, it could be almost as much as 25 or 30% of your tax bill because they're not paying any other taxes other than the 95 mills and a few other levies at the local government. So it's interesting as you look at the different counties and as to what their classification makeup is. So
I agree. It's complex.
yeah. All right. So that kind of brings us up to our final item here is just some guidance on drafting some recommendations. So just to remind everybody, we do have some recommendations that we're working on here that are coming forward. And that's what we're going to do on our next meeting is July 1st at 1 p.m. We'll be pushing recommendations forward and reviewing those. So I would encourage any member of this committee who wants to push a recommendation forward. You can either bring that to my attention or talk to Ralph, and Ralph can work with you in drafting that. We want to use that template that I had sent out previously, and some of the recommendations that we already have, like the TIF recommendation that we had, the property tax assistance program recommendation. So you kind of look at those that we've shared with already, but also what we have coming forward now to our a recommendation that Ralph is drafting on is a higher than simple majority to passing levies, sunsetting levies every 10 years, I believe, looking at converting levies going forward to a dollar amount and no more fixed levies. And so those are the ones that are coming forward. I would like to see, and maybe I'll work, I'd like to see us move forward on a Senate Bill 511, push a recommendation on having the legislature to look at that, probably with some additions that Representative Fern just talked about. Also need to consider something with population growth and a few other items that might make sure that we're not penalizing certain counties that that may need that new growth, and go from there. And then other than that, I like the truth in taxation model too. I think that might be something that we might consider to pushing a recommendation to just to look at that and see. Although I think, like we said, 1510 420, even Senate Bill 511 already covers some of that. And if the counties could actually figure out the bill we passed last session to tell the taxpayers what their taxes might go up with their new proposed budgets, we may have truth in taxation already covered in Montana, just under a different animal. So I don't know, does anybody else have any thoughts, comments on recommendations, or as we move forward, or anything else they want to discuss? Mr. Story.
One of the areas of 1510 420 that no one's discussed in the 511 bill is there's an exemption for county health or for local government health insurance from the cap. They do permissive levies to fund their health insurance. And you might want to just take a look at that and see how that's working, and if you want to at least either include it or not include it in your 511 bill if you repeal 1510 420.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder.
In our data, a lot of them don't have a very high levy there, but there's a couple of them that are up in the 40 mil levy range on their health levy. So
yeah, I had that on my notes of kind of reviewing all permissive levies and see how those are working out there. So Senator McGilvery.
I was just going to add about Mr. Story's comment about not allowing for banked mills, and would that go into 511 too?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to make sure.
Okay.
And I also, just to support you on that truth and taxation idea from Utah. I like that idea. I mean, it does provide more transparency and comment and participation.
Well, that's what's lacking, as I'm sure Commissioner Holmquist and Commissioner Logan can point out, is who shows up for budget hearings? Hardly anybody. And nobody complains until they get that damn tax bill in their hand. And what did you do to me? And typically, well, you voted for this and that levy. That's what happened, more than what happened to the county or city budget. So.
And also one more thing on the having a simple majority to better than a simple majority to pass a levy. Are we also considering in that same idea a turnout percentage requirement? Are those two separate ideas, or are they going the same together?
So there's been some discussion we had some of that discussion at the last meeting, I think, when the education subcommittee kind of looked at the turnout issue. And to me, I mean, the voter turnout kind of becomes more of a difficult thing too, particularly when you look at a city election where everybody, they're typically mail out ballots. So I guess if you didn't turn, all the voters should turn out. They got their ballot in their hand. They failed to vote. So I don't know. I think we can still worth discussing that. I'm kind of leaning more to a higher threshold to pass a levy versus requiring a X amount of voters to turn out. But I don't know. All right, so so it'd be great. I'd be very grateful if others on the committee would either email myself or Ralph some recommendations and thoughts so that we remember everything we've kind of discussed. It's too bad Ralph isn't here, but he'll probably take the time, knowing Ralph, to sit back and review our committee. And I'm sure Nancy will bring him up to date, and hopefully she was keeping some notes too. I tried to, and so as we move forward, but so our next meeting is July 1st, 1 p.m. It'll probably be a couple hours too. We'll have recommendations before that meeting that I'll work with Ralph and others to get pushed out to everybody so we can kind of see what these recommendations that might be coming from our subcommittee will be, and then we'll kind of have a thought on then moving any of those recommendations forward to our July 8th meeting, which is the committee of the whole at 1 p.m. It's and then at that point in time, the committee of the whole will then discuss the recommendations that we're going to be putting in the final report. And I think as Chairman Osmondson said, he wanted to get that final report piece together. And then by the mid or toward the end of July, get public comment back on that. So then that when we come back together in August again, we've got our draft report all ready to go, more or less, with a few maybe minor changes that we can deliver to the governor. So with that, I think we're ready to adjourn unless anybody else has any final thoughts or comments. So, all right. So thank you, everybody, for participating today, and get your recommendations in. And we will see you all again, if not sooner, on July 8th or 1st. Thank you.